A respected Baptist preacher from Atlanta, Georgia, suddenly fell ill and died in 1952. The coroner examined his body to confirm the cause of death, as the attending that was present when he died refused to sign off the death certificate. The coroner's report stated that the Reverend's skin looked ruddy, presenting with brick red colored mucosa due to severe hemorrhage, and the rest of his body was gaunt and emaciated. Even though the two signs were pointing to the most likely culprit, pneumonia, the attending and the coroner were suspicious that the Reverend may have been killed by something more deadly, poison. Compounding the coroner's concerns, he remembered that this was not the first time that deceased individuals presented with these signs in his office. As a matter of fact, these individuals were members of the Reverend's own family. To confirm or assuage his concerns, the coroner decided to test the theory: was the Reverend poisoned? After finding a lethal dosage of what was once considered the king of poisons, arsenic, in the Reverend's body, the coroner decided to alert the authorities regarding the suspected murder of the Reverend and potentially his beloved daughters, who all came out of the Eason Street home where the Elder family lived. With a case opened, the authorities would soon learn that Fannie Mae, Annie Pearl, and Reverend William M. Elder all took ill and died after eating a cryptic meal of bananas and cheese, which they were all served by none other than the Reverend's own wife, Roberta Elder. This is the profile of Mrs. Bluebeard. Hi, and welcome to the most foul true crime. From notorious criminals and unsolved mysteries to chilling tales of deceit and murder, we bring you the most compelling and detailed stories from around the globe. During August 1952, while Reverend William H. Elder was working almost immediately, the Reverend took ill and was sent home. Before the Reverend died, the family physician was called. Reverend Elder was given medicine for an upset stomach, and his wife was instructed to call should he worsen. Reverend Elder's children observed that his wife gave him milk of magnesium, as she did for their deceased sisters, to help ease their symptoms. Unfortunately, by the time the doctor was called again, it was too late. Reverend Elder was dead. According to a 28 August 1954 article in the Pittsburgh Courier, Reverend Elder's family doctor refused to sign the death certificate after noticing his skin had shifted and he had sores on his emaciated body. The attending doctor recalled signing a death certificate the year before for Fannie Mae and another for Annie Pearl, Reverend Elder's daughters, with the latter having a similar skin condition to Reverend Elder's upon her death. Two young lives potentially cut short for unknown reasons. The relevant authorities were called, who then contacted the county coroner. When officials arrived at the house at 1328 Eason Street, they discovered William's body decomposing. The coroner was aware of the deaths of his daughters and knew that the deaths were recorded as presenting with symptoms of pneumonia. The coroner suddenly remembered that pneumonia symptoms are remarkably similar to another well-known cause of death, arsenic poisoning. With his suspicions raised, he decided to test the Reverend's body for poisoning. The test came back positive for arsenic. This is the timeline. Born on 18 July 1910, there is very little information available on Reverend Elder's wife. When she was 18, however, she married Willie Thurmond in Oconee County, Georgia. The couple had a son, James Willie, and moved from Watkinsville to Atlanta, Georgia. Before she turned 21, their daughter, Willie Mae, was born on 19 March 1931. On 14 April 1931, Willie May died at their home at 2116 Harris Street at just 26 days old. Willie May's cause of death was listed as acute bronchial pneumonia. Sometime later, the ill-fated couple separated. The young woman met John Woodward and they soon became common law husband and wife. The new couple moved into 519 Bedford Place in Atlanta with her son from her first marriage, James Willie. On 4 December 1938, John died after a 3-day illness. His cause of death was undetermined. On 10 April 1939, 13-year-old James Willie also suddenly took ill. He died at home in the care of his mother. On 26 June 1939, his cause of death was listed as influenza and malnutrition. Approximately a year later, the widowed woman unofficially married James Garfield Crane in 1940. They moved into 1328 Eason Street in Atlanta. James had a daughter, Nada Bell. When Nada Bell was 16 years old, she gave birth to a son, Jimmy Lee, on 13 October 1941. Jimmy Lee died in the Eason Street home on 10 December 1943. His cause of death was listed as bronchial pneumonia. The woman had a 3-year-old cousin, Gloria Evans, who lived with her in the Eason Street home. Gloria died on 26 December 1944. Her cause of death was listed as acute gastroenteritis. On 17 June 1945, the woman's 60-year-old mother, Kaylee Brown, died of undetermined causes. On 21 July 1947, her husband, James Garfield Crane, died of food poisoning in their Eason Street home. Shortly after his death, the now twice widowed woman met Reverend William Elder, his wife Willie May, and their 5 children. On 29 January 1950, Willie May died from influenza while in the care of the widow. She and the Reverend William M. Elder were soon married and lived with the Reverend's 5 children in her Eason Street home in Atlanta, Georgia. A year into their marriage, one of William's daughters, 9-year-old Fannie Mae, became ill with pneumonia and died on 11 January 1951. Another daughter, 15-year-old Annie Pearl, also became ill with pneumonia and passed away on 23 March 1951. On 22 December 1951, her friend, 93-year-old Nora Scott Harris, died while in the care of the woman. Through all these untimely illnesses and deaths of family members and friends of the woman, variedly attributed to bronchitis, pneumonia, influenza, malnutrition, gastroenteritis, food poisoning, and undetermined causes, not a single soul became suspicious. Now, this leads us back to that one fateful day in 1952 when 47-year-old Reverend William Elder died on 21st August of arsenic poisoning. Arsenic and many of its compounds are especially potent poisons. Small amounts of arsenic can be detected by pharmacopoeial methods. After exposure, whether accidental or deliberate, blood, urine, hair, and nails may be tested for arsenic. However, these tests cannot foresee possible health outcomes from the exposure. The symptoms of acute exposure are gastrointestinal issues, neurological symptoms, cardiovascular effects, and respiratory issues. These symptoms lead to metabolic interferences, which eventually lead to death from multi-system organ failure. But all in all, arsenic is very poisonous. Consumed in large amounts, it can cause death very quickly. Lethal doses resulting in death typically occur within 1 to 4 days of ingestion. Exposure in similar amounts over a period of time can still cause serious complications. Dubbed The inheritance powder, arsenic, was once a common means to murder. A pea-sized dose was enough to kill a grown man, and it was readily available. Arsenic has been sold as a beauty aid and medicinal tonic for centuries and can even be obtained by grinding apple seeds. This pink powder was Mrs. Bluebeard's weapon of choice. With Reverend Elder's test coming back positive for arsenic, Annie Pearl and Fannie Mae were exhumed, and both were found to have arsenic in their hair. Reverend Elder's surviving children informed the authorities that they had observed his wife give him milk of magnesium, as she did for their deceased sisters, to help ease their symptoms. According to Detective J.E. Helms, said that the bottle of milk of magnesium was spiked with liberal pinches of arsenic powder. The police suspected that this was how Reverend Elder's wife administered the poison. The surviving family members were all treated for exposure to arsenic after showing symptoms themselves. This revelation would be met with another startling piece of information. Each of the deceased Elder family members had a life insurance policy taken out in their name. Investigators also discovered that upon their death, the proceeds of the life insurance policies had been paid out to Reverend Elder's wife, Mrs. Roberta Elder. It was not until 1952 that Mrs. Roberta Elder came under suspicion when her third husband, Reverend William H. Elder, died. As soon as they identified her as a suspect, the police never wavered or considered another suspect. This was because Mrs. Elder was the central person to all the victims and the only person who tended on all the deceased while they were sick. Roberta and William were only married for a little over 2 years when he died. The two set up a household with William's 5 children from a previous marriage. As the police continued their investigations, they found that Mrs. Elder left a trail of bodies in her wake, starting in 1931 with the death of a 26-day-old baby, Willie Mae. 13 more potential victims were identified that died mysteriously while living with Roberta. The victims included an adult son, 2 of Mrs. Elder's infant children, a grandchild, and her mother. All their causes of death are listed as undetermined pneumonia, malnutrition, or influenza on their death certificates. According to a 29 November 1952 article in the Pittsburgh Courier, evidence showed manifestations of arsenic in the causes of death of not 13 but 15 people who had lived with Mrs. Elder. Mrs. Elder took out life insurance policies on several of the deceased in amounts ranging from $50 to $225, with the largest policies on Reverend Elder for $500 and $550 on Fannie Mae. She collected on the policies after their deaths. Mrs. Elder was also determined to be the only beneficiary on life insurance policies for the deceased. Other living family members who had previously fallen ill with cases of what they believed to be food poisoning, flu, or bouts of pneumonia began to come forward. The police, however, could never prove that she ever purchased arsenic. However, William's surviving children believed that she got it from her brother's farm or from her sister's Watkinsville home and appeared to be a pink powder inside a brown bag that was intended to kill plant insects. Forming an integral part of the investigation, the coroner declared Mrs. Elder's killing spree as an unheard of thing that read like something out of a storybook. The Pittsburgh Courier ran a story on 20 September 1952, which listed the people who were confirmed to have died under suspicious circumstances in Roberta's home or under her care. 43-year-old Mrs. Roberta Elder was arrested for suspicion of murder. Roberta Elder was dubbed Atlanta's Mrs. Bluebeard, a pejorative term often referring to those that killed multiple family members based on an old French children's fairy tale, the most famous surviving version of which was written by Charles Perrault and first published by Bobin in Paris in 1697 in Histoire au conte de ton passé. The tale tells the story of a wealthy man in the habit of murdering his wives and the attempts of the present one to avoid the fate of her predecessors. The notoriety of the tale is such that Merriam-Webster gives the word Bluebeard the definition of a man who marries and kills one wife after another. According to Pittsburgh Courier reporter William Folks, Mrs. Elder outdid the original namesake in her killing. Because of the number of deaths to which she was linked by police, the black press began to refer to Mrs. Elder as a serial killer or someone who kills multiple people without motive following a predictable pattern. While Mrs. Elder's killing spree did not draw attention from the mainstream white press, the black press, including the Pittsburgh Courier and Chicago Defender, reported on the case and on Elder's victims. A female serial killer, a novelty to reporters and scholars alike, seemed to arouse no interest. The same year as Mrs. Elder's prosecution, a white woman named Nanny Doss was accused of killing 4 out of her 5 husbands, called Lady Bluebeard or the Giggling Granny because she giggled every time she was asked about the killings. The police later suspected that Doss may have killed 11 family members. Nanny Doss's case garnered national attention and continues to arouse public interest today, evidenced by her name appearing in top 10 notable female serial killers, as well as studies on female killers. Doss's notoriety and popular culture capital nearly 70 years after her crimes revealed the disturbing trend in American history that black victims do not draw the kind of media scrutiny and interest that white victims do. Studies have shown that black perpetrators are disproportionately overrepresented in the media, while black victims are underrepresented. Meanwhile, white victims are overrepresented out of proportion to the rate at which whites are crime victims. Psychologist Scott Bourne argues that myths about serial killers and their victims have led to the assumption that black serial killers do not exist in significant numbers. He argues that this occurs because 90% of serial murders kill people of the same race. Because American culture devalues black lives and misrepresents violent crimes as something perpetrated by black criminals against white victims, black violent crime victims remain invisible. The media perpetrates this myth by giving airtime to the kinds of killers that target sympathetic victims, particularly white women. Bourne describes this phenomenon as missing white girl syndrome. In his analysis of the veracity of the missing white girl syndrome, Zach Somers argues that race and gender disparities in news coverage of black versus white victims are supported by the evidence, and that the race and gender of a victim affects not only whether the victim receives any attention, but also how much attention. Though Somers analyzed missing as opposed to women confirmed dead, media studies scholar Sarah Stillman argues that these images and messages offer a subtle instruction manual on which victims to empathize with and which ones to overlook. This has led to the marginalization of black victims in both media portrayals and, by extension, the public consciousness. This kind of sensational news coverage of white women and girls in peril not only obscures a portion of violent crime victims, but it also concretizes the value of whiteness over non-whites, who are often at greater risk of violent crime. Not strictly an American affliction, Stillman argues that in at least one particularly egregious case, Canadian news broadcasts ran hours of news coverage of a whale that died after colliding with a boat propeller. while simultaneously ignoring the murder and disappearance of 32 indigenous women. She points out that the deaths of non-white people, particularly women, have become naturalized in the media coverage. According to her, this is made brutally apparent by the value of one whale's death over that of indigenous women, while white women's disappearances and murders continue to circulate and are even commodified. The case against Mrs. Elder, though circumstantial, was strong. In addition to the deaths by arsenic poisoning, there were witnesses who were ready to testify to seeing pink powder at the Elder home on Eason Street. More family witnesses told the coroner and grand jurors that sacks of the pink powder would turn up at the family's Eason Street home when Mrs. Elder took trips to her brother's farm near Watkinsville. The powdered poison was to kill plant insects, survivors said they were told. On 21st March 1953, an issue of the Chicago Defender reported that Mrs. Elder was indicted on 17 November 1952 by a coroner's jury for the deaths of William, Fannie Mae, and Annie Pearl Elder. At the time, newspapers reported the case as Georgia's biggest murder investigation in history and one of the biggest in the South. The Pittsburgh Courier described Mrs. Elder's appearance in court as neatly dressed, appeared calm and collected, and never showing signs of nervousness. During Mrs. Elder's trial, there was a barrage of testimony from various witnesses. Reverend Elder's surviving stepchildren testified against Mrs. Elder. They told the court she had a brown paper bag of pink powder she retrieved from her brother's farm in Watkinsville, Georgia. She told the children that the powder was used to kill insects on plants. They testified they all felt sick after eating her food. Friends and relatives were afraid to eat at their home. Willie Elder Jr., 20-year-old son of the late Reverend, told the court that Mrs. Elder had administered medicine to each of the 3 people who died and added that he stopped eating at the house after his father's death. When asked why, he replied, "I thought if she had poisoned them, she might try to get me too." He testified that he had also gotten sick twice at the breakfast table after eating. 2 of Roberta's stepchildren testified they saw her give milk of magnesium to Fannie Mae and had become ill themselves after taking doses from the bottle. One of the witnesses, 20-year-old Dorothy Lou Elder, Mrs. Elder's stepdaughter, testified that she had seen something pink in a brown paper sack in the Elder home prior to her father's death. She told the court it was located in the bottom of a cabinet where medicines had been kept and quoted Mrs. Elder saying it was to be used to kill bugs. The mixture found at the farm was a pink mixture. Mrs. Elder's next-door neighbor, Katie Palmer, testified that she visited the Elder home during William, Fannie Mae, and Annie Pearl's sickness and remembered Roberta saying she would give Annie Pearl milk of magnesium. State toxicologist Herman Jones testified that Reverend Elder died of arsenic poisoning. According to a 23 September 1952 Pittsburgh Courier article, when Annie Pearl and Fannie Mae's bodies were exhumed, lethal doses of arsenic were found in their skin and hair. During the trial, Mrs. Elder was told she didn't have to testify but chose to do so anyway. Mrs. Elder's testimony was given in a loud and clear voice. Mrs. Elder claimed the Elder family suffered from tuberculosis, but the remaining members of the family said they never had unusual illnesses until their father married Mrs. Elder. Mrs. Elder denied giving Reverend Elder milk of magnesium, but admitted to having some for herself that wasn't poison and said she wasn't sure who poisoned it. Mrs. Elder admitted in court that Reverend Elder had gotten better, but then had a setback after eating cheese and eggs. she cooked him before his death. When asked about being the beneficiary of the insurance policies, Mrs. Elder didn't deny it, but referenced that the policies weren't enough money for her to take their lives. If I was dirty enough to take a life for insurance, it would have to be some amount, more than $250 or $500, Roberta was quoted saying. That wouldn't be called money. When asked about the excess money from the insurance policies, Mrs. Elder said the children's father used it to buy a television set and an old piece of truck. Mrs. Elder withdrew money from the heroines of Jericho's account when she was treasurer and said she did so because they couldn't decide what bank to use. Mrs. Elder said she took the money home, later discovered it was gone, and that her husband used it to pay bills. After Roberta testified, a judge admitted a letter into evidence that was previously forbidden. The letter was from Mrs. Elder to an alleged boyfriend where she said she would have the money he needed after she returned from a South Georgia city, believed to be a city near her sister's home in Watkinsville, where the arsenic was thought to have come from. The letter was dated 4 January 1951, shortly before Annie Pearl's death. Throughout the investigation and trial, Mrs. Elder maintained her innocence. She appeared calm and collected, never showing signs of nervousness when the verdicts were returned against her. A 6-person jury ruled Mrs. Elder administered arsenic to the 3 known victims. In some manner, though circumstantial, the links between Elder and the victims, the life insurance policies, and the witness testimony were enough that Mrs. Elder was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of her husband, Reverend William M. Elder. Mrs. Elder was sent to prison, having never confessed, and her killing and victims went unremembered. The prosecutor lamented that Mrs. Elder could not be executed because the law prevented it under circumstantial prosecutions. Mrs. Elder was not sentenced for the deaths of her stepchildren, 15-year-old Fannie Mae Elder and 9-year-old Annie Pearl Elder, and she was linked to at least 13 deaths of friends and family members. Roberta Brown Elder was born in Watkinsville in the early 20th century and died in 1973 and is buried in the Watkinsville Cemetery. It is believed that her grave marker, having no birth year and a death year of 1973. Though Mrs. Elder's victims died decades ago, the phenomenon of consistently devaluing black violent crime victims remains to this day, evidenced by the persistent public fascination with Nanny Doss and her white victims, while Mrs. Elder and the victims she is accused of killing remain forgotten. Between 1952 and 1954, the black press followed Mrs. Elder's case through the criminal justice system, while law enforcement found more potential victims to blame on Mrs. Elder, and the white press took little interest. Meanwhile, mainstream media became distracted by the giggling granny who continues to attract infamy as a notorious female serial killer. The danger in ignoring black victims is not only in the devaluing of black life, but also in ignoring systematic oppression that makes black people more vulnerable to violent crimes and less likely to receive justice. Thank you for tuning in to the Most Foul True Crime. This has been the profile on Mrs. Bluebeard, Roberta Brown Elder. On a lighter note, I would like to find out from the audience, have you ever had bananas and cheese as a snack? Please let us know in the comments. After this episode, I will never look at bananas and cheese the same again. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and follow us on social media at The Most Foul True Crime.